Hello, everybody, and welcome to a presentation given by Dr. Jason Miklian on the 23rd of August 2022 at the University of York School for Business and Society in the UK. This was an online talk hosted by myself, Professor Chris Williams, and co-hosted by Jacqueline Yu at Durham University as part of her series of RISE talks, RISE standing for Resilience, Innovation, Strategy and Ecosystems.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm really honored and so happy to be here, especially as part of the RISE lecture series, because, when I was reading about it and seeing some of the other lectures, this concept of, how the role of RISE can help to address pressing, complex issues faced by business and society. That's exactly the sort of work that we've been doing in this business and peace space for about a decade. So one of the things I'm going to really talk about today is, first of all, what in the world business and peace is, how it folds into traditional business and management work, and how we can leverage some of the work that we've done in this business and peace space to really tackle some of the big challenges that we see in ESG, and especially companies and scholars that are trying to understand how best to work through and incorporate the S in ESG in particular. So without further ado, I can just get started. I can try to do a little share screen here. And then I think we can get started. Everyone see the little PowerPoint thing I have? Thumbs up is yeah, great. Perfect, great. Yeah, let's just jump right in. And I'm currently based at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, but I also have a position at the University of Oslo as well. So I kind of bounce back and forth between Latin America, Asia, and Europe with my research. So it's a super exciting and lucky position that I have, and hopefully have some insights that I can share with you all today. So big issues. Let's go right into the biggest ones, which are climate change, the stresses of globalization, global inequality. This trifecta of macro issues is going to produce unprecedented uncertainty, not just in the business world, but for all of our lives. And this is the sort of big picture ideas that scholars in the business and peace world really want to try to tackle to help deliver actionable guidance to try to overcome some of these challenges and work through them. So my research started on this topic about a decade ago by realizing not only, and I come from international relations, political science background, where a lot of the talk about business working in conflict zones has been very negative. It's about, how businesses are messing up, how they're creating conflicts, how they're facilitating warlords and all that negative stuff. But as I was going through and doing research, I also found there were companies who were able to work through conflict zones and even have a more positive impact on the communities. And this wasn't something that, especially on the international relations, political science side, people were talking about all that much. And I saw them doing this in some of the most volatile places on Earth. And it really raised a lot of questions for me, because I wanted to know, number one, how are they doing this? And number two, how can we encourage other companies to do the same and be more positive members of society? So as Chris mentioned, I've been part of a network now for about a decade that has interviewed thousands of businesses, everything from small sole proprietorships to CEOs of Fortune 50 companies, to really try to understand how firms can be more positive and even more profitable actors in such areas of crisis and conflict. And these are the exact places where, you can see that its success and failure for social works by business or even operational works can really have a massive difference on the lives of communities and societies. So this is really the foundation of the business and peace field. But first I can give a quick background on what all of this is about, because, business and peace studies started about 2 decades ago, led by Tim Ford out of Indiana in particular. And it really started with a question, which was, what does ethical business look like in conflict zones and fragile spaces and areas of crisis? And then, of course, quickly after that, a follow-up question emerged, which was, can businesses even help grow peace in these areas as well? And over the last 2 decades, we've seen this explosion of interest, not just on the academic side, but especially on the policy side through organizations like the UN. So we have a quote here from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, where he's talking about bringing the private sector into this space, where he says that companies have to be a driving force to push governments and themselves to assume societal responsibilities in areas of crisis. And if they do their job properly, they're indeed contributing decisively for peace. And we can also see this philosophy growing in how businesses interact with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and more recently, how they interact with ESG and the social or S of ESG in particular. So I would argue that in many ways, this is really the forefront of business and society research, or not the forefront, the frontier, because these projects have real human impact. And the hope for a lot of us business and peace scholars is if we can decipher what works for business and society in the hardest places, that could work anywhere. So what do we study? This Business for Peace, as I mentioned, it really builds on these studies generally from political science that look at the role of business as a conflict actor. And from the business and management side, it really tries to expand stakeholder theory-based relationships by studying more comprehensive ecosystems of private sector society relationships. Now, this cross-disciplinarity, as I show here on the slide, it can take people in many, many different directions. It can look at business ethics and CSR. It can focus on the costs and opportunities for businesses to engage in these sorts of peace issues. Many people look at the role of leadership, management, and organization through the operational side. Others look at innovation and peace tech to try to see who is pushing the envelope for private sector peace relations. Sustainability and ESG are very big, and also the community perceptions of business. In terms of what sorts of methodologies we use, some use qualitative. Increasingly, we're seeing quantitative methods being used and a bit of theory building. But in terms of fields, we have people who come from business and management, IR, political science, ethics, law, development studies, area studies, human rights. It's really this hodgepodge of scholars who are seeing these sort of interactions and coming at it from many different angles. So a lot of the work that we do is collaborative. Pretty much most all business and peace publications are usually co-authored, usually with people from different disciplines. And this is great because it helps give us different sorts of insights that might otherwise be missed. The one challenge, of course, is that when it comes time to publish, it can be a little bit trickier. And then when we take things back to our respective academic silos, if you will, sometimes we have to do a little bit more explanation than we otherwise would. But to be frank, a lot of the work that we do is challenging some of the big assumptions that people tend to promote. Companies like to promote that anything that they do in a conflict area is peace positive. Think of the sorts of projects that they love to put in little inset boxes on their glossy annual reports. International organizations like the IMF and World Bank love to talk about or imply or even explicitly say sometimes that any economic growth in these hard spaces of conflict and crisis is peace positive. And even NGOs will talk up this private sector peace relationship because, many times they see financial benefits in working with the private sector. But there are big, big problems with all of those assumptions. So as scholars in the business and peace field, we often spend as much time trying to, challenge these excited overclaims as we spend working with, trying to figure out what works empirically. Because at the end of the day, of course, everyone likes talking about peace, but if we're not rigorous in what we're actually testing, those sorts of overclaims and assumptions can torpedo the entire project about bringing in the private sector into peace building before it even really gets started. And one thing I would say that most of us in the business and peace space have in common is that, a recognition that the only people who can really say whether a private sector intervention in a given community is effective is the community itself. So I can give a quick example of what business and peace research and action looks like from here in Colombia. because Colombia is, by pretty much all accounts, a really hard place to do business. It's hosted a multi-decade conflict between a leftist insurgency and the government. And over the previous decades, there's also, of course, been other insurgent groups, drug mafias, organized crime syndicates, paramilitaries. It's really one of the world's most complicated conflict settings. But one unique thing is that the business community has been very involved in the peace process for many, many years. And that's because of a number of different reasons, primarily that the large companies in Colombia have been very involved in government generally, but they also recognize that they cannot extricate themselves from a conflict and expect to be able to do business as usual. So, on the screen here are a couple of quotes that some CEOs here in Colombia have told me, and it's trying to get through this puzzle of how do I work through conflict? How do I make a more positive contribution to society? And how do I improve my bottom line in the process? So one CEO said the question was clear. What do I need to do so that the insurgents don't plant a bomb in my factory? Do I bring in the army or do I build 6 schools? And this is really encapsulates this notion of like, do I go for traditional security or a human security approach? And it's something that CEOs think about a lot here. Another CEO was much more blunt. He said, if you want peace, you need to sit down with those barbarians. And one thing that's very interesting here is when he talks about barbarians, he's not talking about the insurgent groups or the fighters. He's also including local and national government officials in this assessment of who the barbarians are. So they understand that when you look at conflict as a zero-sum game, then you have to pick a side. But if you can try and figure out a way to take it beyond that zero-sum approach, maybe this is somewhere that the business community can play a more positive role. So I can start with a success story here because sometimes those sorts of things are a little bit few and far between when we talk about business and conflict. I did a 2-year study with Juan Pablo Medina Biquel here on the role of the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, or FNC. They're one of the world's largest coffee producers. They produce and sell coffee to everyone from Starbucks in the USA to Lavazza in Italy. They're known locally here as the Juan Valdez brand. And they're very, very important and have been important to the Colombian economy for nearly 100 years. But about a decade ago, they ran into a real problem. Coffee prices were crashing, there was a rise of conflict in the producer areas, and there was general insecurity in the country. So FNC's profits were crashing, they were on the brink of bankruptcy, and the CEO realized that the traditional security apparatus that they working with the government, it just wasn't working, and they needed a new approach. So what they did is they developed a project called the Footprints of Peace. They approached the Spanish Agency for International Development, and their aim was to kind of merge best practice in peace building from a development agency with best practice on the business side to try to help farmers in their communities. So they spent 10 million euro over the course of 4 years to try to develop some sort of innovative local peace model that focused on community engagement. Now I said that this is a success, and yeah, great. And I said it worked, but at first it was actually a disaster. For the first year, they could not get farmers to buy into this project. They could not get local communities to buy in. And the reason was something that probably many of us are very familiar with, is that, when they first came into the communities with this great idea about how they're going to build peace, nobody believed them. It took a year of dedicated presence before the communities actually believed that the company cared as much about building local peace as they did for their own bottom line. Because, in many of these conflict areas, and we see this in Colombia, but also all over the world, communities are used to people coming in, promising that they're going to change the world, and then vanishing 3 months later. So there's a skeptical community of people who have lived through conflict their entire lives. And it took a very, very long time for FNC to really prove to these people that it mattered. But when it did, they achieved success in a way that was superior in many ways to what the government could even achieve. And they did this in 5 ways. First, the FNC realized that companies actually have unique abilities and skills that they can use to help build local peace. And they leveraged those through the help of a development agency. So they each had their own set of expertise that they could deliver. Secondly, was what I mentioned about FNC. They have this real vested interest in the community. So their time horizon is forever. They plan on, growing coffee and producing coffee forever. So their local investment was much higher than you might otherwise see in a company. And that was something that the local community really understood. The business NGO partnerships have unique advantages as well. So the NGO was able to provide expertise on what sorts of peace projects actually work, and the FNC was able to provide the reputational background in these communities because people knew them from a very long time, so that they worked together and they diffused the individual risk. And together they were able to deliver something that seemed much more legitimate once they finally got operations going. So positive long-term community relationships matter quite a deal. And the FNC had a history of being known in these communities, which was also very helpful. And especially when it comes to community integration, according to the farmers that lived through these experiences, when FNC was able to bring together the government, paramilitaries, the insurgent groups, and the local community all together just simply to sit down and talk about things, they realized that they could find positive sum solutions that didn't involve just one group controlling the area. So FNC united people who had the most to lose from the war, and they found ways to go forward together. And then 5 years later, farmers earned higher prices and had greater yields, all while working in a more secure business environment. So of course, B4P scholarship, Business and Peace scholarship goes beyond case studies alone. Here's another project that we published last year as part of a 7-member team in Harvard Business Review, which tried to study the business impact of societal action more broadly. We designed it to generate insights on how companies, especially smaller companies, can work through crisis in violent urban settings. The picture here is of a toy seller in Caracas. We talk about large MNCs quite a bit, but of course, smaller companies are 90-some% of businesses overall, especially in the developing world. So, and they're just trying to get through very difficult situations that they find themselves in. So we did a survey of 7 violent global cities and pinned it to issues that came up during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we found 78,000 respondents in Bogota and Medellin, in Colombia, Beirut, Cape Town, Caracas, San Pedro Sula, and San Salvador. And, of course, in these spaces, many of the biggest challenges that companies, especially small businesses face are socio-political in nature, not financial. But these sorts of challenges are very complex, they're systemic, and they're hard to quantify. So this survey, of course, had a lot of findings and some very rich data, and I'm happy to circulate the HBR piece for those who'd like to read a little bit more about it. But I can focus on one of the findings here today, which is that companies that engaged with communities during times of violence and crisis were much more successful in working through violence. This can take many different forms. It can include hiring disadvantaged workers, assisting the unemployed, and other concrete community building measures. And what we found most striking is that this work really pays off. Companies that increased their community efforts during when COVID-19 hit were actually 9 times more likely to survive over the next year than those who didn't. And successful firms like this quickly realize that they're influenced by and they're able to shape their social systems in a way that those who withdrew could not. Now, I do a lot of this work with a gentleman by the name of John Katsos at American University of Sharjah. And, we're doing work that I can draw upon here for an upcoming book that we have. And when we talked with these sorts of successful firms who increased their community engagement, they really kept coming back to 3 strategies that they employed. Sometimes they even found them out by accident. The first is that they elevated their community relationships to true partnerships. The second is that they never relied on the government alone for guidance on what to do in these spaces. And the third is that they took principled political stance. So I'll go through these one at a time here. And I think that one of the most important things that John and I stress is that these insights come from crisis settings, or they come from settings of violence, but they work just as well in the United Kingdom or in the United States for companies as they do in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Syria. And that's one of the things that I think is a big, big takeaway for the business and peace research in general, is that although we research conflict areas, what we find are a lot of correlations for things that work in even temporary crisis settings in the developed world as well. So first, and this is probably the most obvious, especially for those listening today, is that companies that made the community a true partner in their social political strategies were more successful and more resilient during times of crisis. The sorts of businesses who just saw the local community as customers or as staff or a source of raw materials tended to suffer when crisis hit, because they tended to withdraw and cut ties with their community, which then made the community feel like there was no need to try to support the company through crisis. And shutting out the community multiplied their risk of failure. But businesses who created a joint stake in the success of both the business and the community tended to be much more resilient, and they tended to be much more successful both during a crisis or a conflict and also immediately afterwards as well. And they also realized that local context is key. You can't do the same sorts of community work in everywhere and expect that you're going to get the same result. A lot of it really boils down to listening to what the community says is important to them, figuring out how that you can work together to help resolve these issues, and perhaps most importantly, prioritizing what the community wants over what you may believe as a business is the most important to you. And that's often the most challenging one that a lot of country managers that we speak with tend to have a hard time with, is reflecting upon the community's needs and priorities even more so than the business itself. But it tends to make a more profitable company in the long run too. All right. The second insight is that companies have to not just talk with local government, but also talk with beyond them. And this is a real key tenet where we try to expand stakeholder theory in general. Because in me and John's research, one of the most common mistakes we saw is when companies go into fragile or conflict-affected areas and they only talk with local government officials as if they are the ones who represent the community. But when public institutions are very weak, that approach can be a recipe for disaster. Now, this is a picture I took in Odisha, India, when I was doing research on the Korean steel manufacturer POSCO, who tried to build a multi-billion-dollar plant. And they relied solely on local officials to try to clear the land and to try to get the project started. But the problem was the local officials were so corrupt that there was already a huge amount of tension between the local community and the officials to begin with. And when POSCO sided with the local officials and refused to talk with the community, it was actually POSCO who became the enemy as opposed to the local officials. So what you see here is the local community is barricading the land. They're refusing to let POSCO officials in. And eventually they had a leftist insurgency that they encouraged to come in and protect the community by force. And over time, it led to a giant disaster. POSCO wrote off $1 billion on the project and basically gave it up for pennies to a local competitor because they messed up the situation so badly. So these sorts of very small things that companies can do from the beginning can have these ripple effects over time if they don't really understand the local community and engage it in big projects like what POSCO had, or even smaller projects. But those who work beyond the government from the beginning tend to have better community relations. And one thing that's really interesting is that the community can serve as a warning beacon for crisis itself, because they tend to have a better understanding of how socio-political events evolve than country managers do, especially foreign ones. And our third insight was one that we saw over and over again, and it was so counterintuitive. It was that companies succeed in crisis by making principled political choices, even when they parts of the population disagree with them, or they might be seen as provocative. Those that take a clear stand in line with their values are ones that tend to win support, not just from their supporters, but also even from detractors. So the picture here is of, American yogurt company, Chobani CEO, Hamdi Ulukaya. So about 5 years ago, Chobani was a $3 billion company. He built this by prioritizing community relationships. He included progressive politics as part and parcel of a business. But when Donald Trump came into power, Chobani started getting attacked, especially online, for those very sorts of progressive policies that Hamdi supported. Now, a lot of companies in this position would kind of shrink and maybe try to play both sides or tone down their politics. But Hamdi actually doubled down, and he included more pro-refugee policies in his hiring. He was more vocal about the importance of progressive politics and standing up for human rights. Now, this, of course, won him some new customers on the left, but since he was so clear and consistent and honored his principles, he didn't actually lose that many customers on the right either. And now 5 years later, his company is worth over $12 billion, and it's one of America's most respected firms. So one of the lessons here is that the principled stands that he took, if they are consistent with values, if they're backed up by real action, that's something that's respected much more, even by the most polarized communities, than those companies that try to satisfy everyone and end up satisfying no one. So, this is all, those three insights are all about what's best for the company, but what's actually best for the community? That's also quite important, and it folds into what is called the social license to operate. Now, this is something that communities give basically by means of a trade. If a company is respectful of the community will be respectful back. Right before our talk, we mentioned, I believe I heard mention of Tata. And this is another company that I've researched in India a fair bit. And they are one of the companies that have actually been able to succeed through situations of conflict in ways that other companies in India have had much more difficulty, because they tend to have a much stronger understanding of the relationship between company and community that extends beyond those primary stakeholders that like stakeholder theory would talk about. So they tend to look beyond the immediate impact of the company, and this is something I'll talk about a little bit farther. But when companies learn what makes the community feel secure, not just the company, they build alliances with the community, and they're able to survive through crisis in a way that makes them much more resilient than their competitors. So let's bring this to, to business and society research more broadly, because the social license to operate opens us up to this, this big, much more visible set of guidelines that everyone knows and talks about today, which is ESG. And we've seen so much, especially over the last few months, about not only the expansion of ESG, not only how pretty much every big company has an ESG department or staff, but also the backlash to it too. I'm sure we've all read the recent Economist articles about how we should just focus on E and how that's going to make things all better. And to be honest, there's probably a lot of managers who are relieved to read that, because, the G and especially the S are really, really hard things to do. And it gives an excuse to kind of pull back on those tricky, political issues. But, that advice, of course, I think is going to ring hollow in a world where shareholders, employees, and the public all demand that companies are engaged social actors in a way that, even 10 years ago didn't exist. But at the same time, we all get it, right? At its worst application, we do see it. We see people using ESG as greenwashing or box ticking or just navel gazing about the good companies do, self-promotion, and all these other bad things. It really makes my skin crawl to say that, Elon Musk actually has a little bit of a point in his critique of what ESG should be and should be about. But listening to the critics doesn't mean that we should stop trying on what ESG is. I disagree strongly with that, because we ask ourselves, who wins in the scenario where we cut out the S and the G? And it's not going to be the communities, and over the long term, it's not going to be the company. But we still have to address these sorts of critiques because they are gaining traction. Because doing ESG right is really difficult, and I think that that recognition is something that companies and analysts and scholars are just starting to really grapple with. That said, there's a quote here from one of the godfathers of ESG, Paul Watchman, and he says that ESG has nothing to do with morality, ethics, or politics. It's a means of assessing risk. Now, I would actually disagree with this quite strongly, because investment decision making, every investment decision, every sort of community engagement is inherently political. So I understand why he wants to make a claim like this, because it's wonderful to think that you can remove politics from the equation of making investment decisions or being more responsible to the community. But when you take it out, then you have this, this classic collective action problem where, improving society then just becomes nobody's responsibility at all. So this is where I really think that the business and peace research can come in and provide a little bit of nuance and insight in a way that's a little bit new. Now, this picture here, oh, I'm sorry, it's pixelated so terribly now. This picture here, I think, is a great example of, where we kind of lose the plot with ESG a little bit. So when Russia invaded Ukraine earlier this year, there were a bunch of people, at least in my LinkedIn feed, that started talking about how, ESG is all about social responsibility. So we can invest in arms manufacturers that are giving arms to Ukraine because that's a social good and that's the right thing to do. Now, whereas one can support such a company, I think if you start talking about arms manufacturers as being an ESG investment, you've really lost your way somewhere. So one of the things that I've worked on a little bit over the last few months is basically try to figure out how to save ESG proponents from themselves and their desires to make everything about ESG if it happens to fit a given desire or a given interest at a given point. So the question really then becomes, how can firms deliver this measurable positive impact while avoiding or even engaging with these minefields around social and political corporate action? Now, this is a question that a lot of people in the ESG space are just starting to kind of think about, but it's one that has been a foundational principle of business and peace research, for the last 2 decades. Because, we're all about, what makes a firm succeed or fail in these very complex social environments where corporate social decision impacts are really amplified. So we feel that there's some research and some analysis here that we can really bring to this space and help answer some of these questions. So there's 3 lessons that I think that matter quite a bit. And lesson number 1 here is that business and peace research tends to incorporate more stakeholders than usual stakeholder theory typically does. And this picture is thanks to Jay Joseph at American University of Beirut, where we think about, traditional stakeholder groups or traditional stakeholder theory. That's all of the things in the gray here. Whereas an expanded understanding of what stakeholders are to especially larger firms also includes, some of the things that we see here in red. And then when we start thinking about more expansive stakeholder maps, you get beyond this narrow conception of, the S in ESG that tends to be either, corporate friendly enough to be able to be measurable easily, or small enough to be able to be discussed in a way that reduces its complexity. But if we expand our concept of materiality, like what Tata did in India, the boxes in the red are what can matter to societal development overall. Because if you take, people like quasi-political actors or vulnerable groups or civil society, if you try to take them out of the equation as a primary or secondary stakeholder, then you are often left with activities that might do limited good for certain small groups of individuals, but they can either be ineffective or even have negative consequences on the socio-political ecosystem as a whole. And this is really classic systems analysis work. It's the real, peace building part of business and peace that really we try to bring to business and management analysis to show the business society relationships that are often not prioritized in a lot of business management work. Now, the second thing is that business and peace is often more explanatory than stakeholder theory in areas of crisis and uncertainty. It's like I do have to admit I have this secret, shameful passion for these horrible business stock photos that you see all over the internet, and this is one of them here. But I promise, it's actually apt. It actually matters, or I hope it does. I don't know. I think the photo's great. So, anyway, one thing that has constantly struck us over the last decade or two in business and peace research is how often stakeholder theory comes up short in trying to understand what is actually happening in these hard places as an explanatory variable, especially when stakeholders don't act in ways in which you would presume them to as logical actors. So when we talk to businesses, they often ask questions, okay, like, this is best practice. Why isn't this working? Or why does the community still hate us when we're doing all these great things for the community? And a big part of this actually goes all the way back to the design stage in what businesses try to do for societies. As a counterpoint, NGOs often have very sophisticated social impact frameworks for their projects. But guidance for businesses is often these sorts of lofty targets where, effectively, if you build it, they will come. If you build a hospital, everyone will love you. If you do this or do that, there's no real benchmarks within those for what social impact actually is. And we've seen this time and time again, where we see businesses try to do positive social things for communities, but it actually triggers violence. We've seen this in Nigeria, in Colombia, Sierra Leone, Myanmar, Lebanon, elsewhere, when companies do best practice by the book analysis, but they're not communicating with the community before they do it, and it actually triggers violence. So this kind of shows that stakeholder theories cannot be compartmentalized away from their broader macroeconomic and societal settings. And a lot of the business and peace literature really tries to break through the noise of this well-meaning advice that can be counterproductive in the long term. So the picture is very much emblematic of, when we talk to CEOs, they often feel like this. They feel like, when they're trying to do the right social thing, they have people from all the different departments yelling at them, trying to figure out what they want to do. So is it any wonder that a lot of them tend to retreat into whatever number-based or quantification-based solution they can find, because there's so many different people, both inside and outside of the company, telling them what the right thing to do is in difficult social settings. How are we doing on time? We got a little bit of time? A little bit of time, yeah. And the third, I think, is the biggest and most complicated one, is that the S and ESG initiatives are really outpacing our theories of business and society relationships. This is growing so fast that you see companies doing all sorts of different things to try to fulfill this S box. But I would say maybe 9 times out of 10, when I'm looking at what companies are doing and talking about in this space, they're not really empirically connected to anything that is proven to deliver positive societal benefits. It's just kind of driven by this assumption that anything you do for society is a positive thing. And along with that is the problem of definition. I've read maybe 30 different ESG reports, talking about definitions of S and ESG, and they tend to have 30 different definitions of what the S actually is. Which is, in a way, I think that's okay, because that's not what really concerns me. What concerns me the most is that there is this push for standardization and quantification of S, which could be a recipe for failure. And one example I can give about this is the big push, especially about 5 years ago, on how jobs can create peace. So the UN, the World Bank, and other large especially financial institutions, really pushed the growth of jobs in conflict areas as a way to build peace. But unfortunately, it's not just adding jobs, it's the type of jobs. It's who gets these jobs and how these jobs are integrated into society that matter much more so than the actual job creation itself. Because, as from the peace and conflict perspective, if you're actually just giving jobs to communities that are already prioritized by the government, it actually increases horizontal inequality and it can increase the potential for conflict. So you have to understand what sorts of contextual background you have in any sorts of projects before you can say anything blanket like jobs create peace or economic growth creates peace. It's all contextual, and that's something that's often stripped away when we start talking about these sorts of S activities. So, in other words, what's claimed to be a legitimate impact could actually be divorced from any sort of scholarship or empirical evidence on what is truly impactful in a positive way. But this is, again, something that business and peace scholars have been researching for 20 years. And a lot of our work specifically looks at this relationship between activity and impact and which sorts of things are actually proven to make positive impact in communities. So a lot of what we do is we study companies who say they're doing good work in societies, say that they're building peace, and then trying to assess if they are actually, making a positive contribution, and if so, why. So I know that many of you are probably working on some of these questions from very different angles. So I can probably end on just a few of the things that I see as forward research agendas, not only to build business and peace scholarship more generally, but also think a bit more about how it can fold into other fields and help bridge some of those gaps that we see between them. And the first is that business and peace especially needs a lot more quantitative studies that look at some of these issues from a more economic and socio-political perspective. I came actually from political science as a qualitative guy, and I personally got a little bit annoyed when all the quantitative people came up and they took a lot of the interest and attention, especially from policymakers. But now that I do more mixed methods work, and now that I see that there's a lot of case studies in the business peace side, I see what's really missing with that, and that helps give the rigor to business and peace research that I think is missing a little bit, because otherwise we just become this sort of island of case studies that often can just turn into anecdotes that make it much more challenging for us to see the big picture. Second, along with that, though, of course, there needs to be a lot more diversity of the sort of studies that we do in the qualitative area, because we kind of as scholars in business peace, we kind of gravitate towards companies who are working in the hardest settings, but we're also kind of lacking similar studies in crisis, but maybe non-conflict regions of East Asia, Europe, Middle East, and South America in particular. This will really help us understand what's comparative and what has more generalizable value. And third, I think that this is somewhere where we can really start to work better with business and management and with people working in organizations, is that we need a deeper look at company policies, both before and after crisis. One way we could do this is, there are opportunities by undertaking natural field experiments in locations where one company uses, for example, peace-aware policies or a more expansive stakeholder map, and then others does not. And last, I would say that the field just needs a generally a better understanding of how the private sector influences community systems to help learn how companies can best help local societies. And this can unite the old CSR agendas with business and peace and ESG to really help change the focal point, at least in some cases, from the company to the community, and seeing the interaction between those two as a mutually beneficial and mutually destructive activity. So I like to end on this image of a businessman in Iraq, because it shows that even in the hardest crisis settings, a lot of time people who run businesses, who work for businesses, they need to push through. They don't have the option of leaving or of shutting down operations. So our research a lot of times wants to help people like this gentleman. How can he succeed ethically in a situation where shutting down just isn't an option? How does he work through this? Now, the good news is that we have a lot of lessons that we can employ to help people like him make legitimately positive contributions to communities. And that's, in many ways, that's just like the worst possible cliche about win-win things. But it has come to life, and we have seen that when companies engage with their communities in certain particular ways, they can grow their business and also help improve communities both during conflict and after conflict. So, businesses who work in the hard places really can help make more resilient communities. And our role as scholars is really to help refine those conditions and give more actionable guidance to those sorts of individuals who work for companies who want to do the right thing, but really have no clue where to begin. Because as I said in the beginning, we have these massive macro issues that are going to turn the entire world into a planet of waves of crisis and uncertainty. And, since that global crisis is really coming for us all, why not work to try to be as ready as we can wherever we are in the world? Thank you very much.
We hope you found this talk very interesting and inspiring. And if you would like to continue the conversation in any shape or form, please contact us at our respective institutions. Many thanks for watching.